Right. Good morning. It's about time to get started. So as you are getting settled, I'll mention a couple of things. One is hopefully third time is a charm on the presentation. Interestingly, I've been using one version of PowerPoint to create the slides, and the version in the back is having trouble with it. So have not figured that out. So this time we're switching to the Mac software, and we'll hope it pulls off. I'm kind of an amateur with it, so we'll see what happens. Second thing is, at the end of last week, there was a reading assignment, and if you happen to read that, that's wonderful, but we're skipping over that section. I'm mashing together two series, and that was next in the sequence. And at this point, I'm thinking, I'm not sure we have enough time to fit that in. So maybe at the end, we might come back and hit that lesson. So we're going to, it was the Sermon on the Mount. So if you read it, it was a good thing, but not terribly related to what we'll be talking about this morning. So this morning, again, this is week 3 on the Kingdom of God is Like. A lot of this quarter is going to be based on what's called the Kingdom Parables. So we'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. But we're going to start with an introduction to parables in general. We're not going to spend the entire class on it like you would maybe if you were doing a quarter on the parables. But I'm going to briefly go over some things about parables because of the number of parables we're going to be looking at. And then we will look at a couple of the shorter parables that have time to fit in after the intro material. We'll spend most of our time in Matthew 13. And if you're looking there, you'll see we're not taking them in that order. Some of it is, I think, as here, just because of, you could fit them in rather than a particular strategy for what the materials are. So this is where we are. Just as a quick review, we spent the first and second weeks introducing the idea of the kingdom and how it developed among the Jewish teaching. So at first they had a king. Actually, at first they didn't have a king. They wanted a king. So they ended up having king. The first king was Saul, and then David and Solomon, and so on. So they had a human king. And then the idea began to get to come into the teaching of the prophets about a Messiah, because the kingdom was destroyed, it was conquered, and then they began to look for a renewal of the kingdom, that there would be a king that would come back, a king that would come to power and would lead Israel as it was when they were a powerful kingdom in the days of, say, David and Solomon. Then we talked about how, as time went on, you get into the New Testament time, John the Baptist came and he was saying, the kingdom is at hand, the kingdom is near. And then Jesus ushered in the kingdom and he taught about the kingdom is. And then last week, we kind of reviewed a little bit of that. One of the key prophecies was from Daniel, where he prophesied that there would be starting with Babylon, which was the current to him kingdom, there would be, 3 other kingdoms, and then in the time of that fourth kingdom, Rome, that the kingdom of God would be established as part of that messianic teaching. But then last week, as we kind of concluded, we were getting into the idea that, when is all this happening? Turns out it's not a physical king that's going to be sitting on a physical throne, but that this reestablishment of the kingdom came to the earth and was embodied, maybe that's the word, on earth at the day of Pentecost when the church was established. So again, as we concluded last week, it was a spiritual kingdom and not an earthly kingdom. And our key passage and our key takeaway from last week came from the verse where Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. So for us, we belong to not the government of Republicans and Democrats and independents and libertarians and presidents and governors and all that, but we belong simultaneously. We can't avoid where we live, but we belong to another government, and it is not of this world. Okay, so that's a recap on where we are as kingdoms. As I said, we're going to be talking about parables. So the word parable, just as a little bit of background, it's from the Greek. It comes from para and balo, which, there we go, which means to lay alongside or to throw alongside. I thought it was interesting that, of course, depending on what English translation you're reading, the word parable was actually used several times in the Old Testament. We think, it's a Greek word, and it comes from parabalo. If you're math inclined, same word as parabola. But why would it be, so prominent in the Old Testament, which was in Hebrew? Well, of course, there were intermediate translations. There was a translation of the Old Testament into Greek, and then that was heavily influenced the translations into English. But I think it was primarily in the Psalms. I didn't read through all of them. There was, 30 or 40 or so, maybe more. But the word was translated sometimes as parable. So there was already a concept of a parable. If you've turned to Matthew 13, I mentioned that's where we'll be earlier. You can go ahead and do that if you haven't. First question is, why parables? A parable from the word, to throw alongside, to lay something down alongside. Also from the same root is parallel, things that run alongside. If something is parallel, they follow one another. There is a relationship between them. So a parable, just in the literary sense, is a figure of speech. We talk about similes and metaphors and things like that. So it's in that same family. It's generally a story, some everyday common relatable thing. So if we get to Matthew 13, in verse 3 he says, speaking of Jesus, and he told them many things in parables, saying, and then it starts relating a parable. If I could get a couple of readers, these are sequential. I split them up into two references, verses 10 to 13 and verses 14 to 16. If I get a couple of people to read just one after the other.
Then the disciples came and said to him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" And he answered them, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand."
Indeed, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, "You will indeed hear, but never understand, and you will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear."
All right, thank you. The disciples ask a pretty short question, and they get a couple of paragraphs as an answer. And they said, "Why are you doing all your teaching in parables?" And then you get this answer. And as I'm marked up there, it is also reported in Mark and Luke. It's in all three of those Gospels. So he says, to you it's been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom. Notice kingdom of heaven, our subject for the quarter. The mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been granted. Therefore, verse 13, I speak to them in parables, because while seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. The word mystery comes up in the Bible numerous times. Paul uses it in particular when he's talking about the mystery of the gospel. Does anyone know the meaning that he uses? What is a mystery? A secret, exactly. As a matter of fact, that's my next line. The mysteries or the secrets of the kingdom. The point of a mystery, if you're watching a mystery movie or reading a book, there's something that's hidden. There's a secret. There's something that's unknown. And the whole point is getting to where it's revealed. So, Paul uses it a couple of times at least, talking about the mystery of the gospel, so that over the ages there was this mystery or this hidden truth, and it was going to be the salvation of people, all people, through Jesus and the gospel. And then he says, now it's revealed. So finally you get to the end of the book. Well, here we're not quite at the end of the book, but Jesus is talking to the disciples, and he says, to you it's been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom, but to them it has not. Then to follow that up, later in the chapter, it says, all these things Jesus spoke to the crowds in parables, and he did not speak anything to them without a parable. This was so that what was spoken through the prophet would be fulfilled. I will open my mouth in parables. And this is the one that got me kind of sidelined last night reading through interesting references. I will open my mouth in parables. I will proclaim things hidden since the foundation of the world. And that's from Psalm 78. So if you take that background and then ask on a practical sense, why would he have taught in parables? Why would he have taught by telling a story that, makes a comparison to the kingdom? I'm sorry?
So they could understand.
So they could understand, that's right. Yeah.
And that part then it's easier to understand the kingdom that Jesus would talk about.
Right. It helps in understanding some of the things regarding the kingdom, while ultimately, when you see the big picture, are straightforward. At this point, as we've talked in the last couple of weeks, they were looking for an earthly kingdom. So Jesus comes and he starts teaching people about the kingdom, and he gives them very practical things to look at that they can take to heart. So the disciples, as we've also already said, they didn't have a perfect understanding, but they certainly were listening to Jesus. He was teaching them off to the side. But the crowds, it says he did not speak anything to them without a parable. Another thing, if we go back to verses 14, 15, if we go back and look at this, there's the hearing without understanding concept. Why would somebody have heard the parables, the stories, but not understood?
Well, it says it hasn't been granted to them.
It hasn't been granted. True. Well, the teaching that the disciples were granted had not been given to them. But he was still teaching the followers, the crowds, in parables.
They were interested in the story. Hey, that's a neat story, but they weren't looking for a deeper meaning.
That's right. Some people were not necessarily looking for the deeper meaning. How about this phrase? Oh, go ahead.
Maybe part of it is too, it took his disciples until Pentecost to really figure everything out. So you would expect they'd have a better chance of understanding it as opposed to the people. So maybe part of it is, as his parables were retold, and for us too, you can look backwards, and it helps us to figure things out much more than if those parables had never been spoken.
Right. So the comment was that, it took even the disciples a while to understand some of the full implications. The crowd was not necessarily ahead of them on that. So it does take some time. I'm actually thinking about some of the people that were not the crowd following because they wanted to hear. What about the Pharisees? Yeah, I like this phrase from the heart of this people has become dull. So they were hearing, but they weren't understanding because they were their heart was contrary to Jesus' teaching. So I really like this one. So we have in this hearing and not understanding and hearing and understanding, there's three levels. Jesus is teaching his disciples, and he's off to the side, he's giving them extra teaching. Then he's teaching to the crowds with parables. And then the opponents are hearing those same parables. They're hearing that same public teaching, but they're not understanding because their hearts are dull. All right, so to go back to our question about why would he use parables, these figures of speeches. We've mentioned one, probably the biggest one, is it was relatable to the people. It was something that they could say, oh, yeah, I understand that. And the kingdom is like that. Maybe I have some insight. So that's probably, and it says that he was teaching for the people that had that heart that was receptive and that were looking for meaning about the kingdom. And then the other thing, we've already just mentioned, the other reason, it's a little slow today, is the meaning was hidden from the opponents. Those Pharisee leaders, they weren't looking for the spiritual kingdom. They were probably some of those that were still looking for the physical kingdom, and they were worried they were going to lose power, So the parables had a multi-purpose meaning in the use of them. It fulfilled prophecy, for one thing, but it was a way to teach in a relatable way, and it was a way to teach a specific people or a specific crowd. All right, so as we get into the kingdom parables, if I remember the number correctly, Jesus taught 43 parables. 13 of them started off, the kingdom of heaven is like. And then sometimes it's a long parable, sometimes it's a short parable. But there are 13 of these that says the kingdom of heaven is like. So we're going to spend the bulk of the rest of the quarter looking at these kingdom parables. If you look at how they're broken down, again, very relatable to the society at that time. 5 of them were agricultural in nature, talking about, weeds and planting seeds and that kind of thing. 4 of them were about money. I believe I heard once that the most common topic that we have record of Jesus teaching about is money. Society operates through exchange of goods. So again, a very relatable thing that he could use as an example. A little bit less relatable for us, but society then would have feasts or banquets. So there are two parables about feasts. One about fishing. We'll talk about one of those today. And it's pretty, I think, easy to get the insight from, even if you're not a fisherman. One about cooking. Most people have at least spent a little time in the kitchen, even if it's just watching. So that one is... Now, it's not an everyday type of cooking for us, for most people, but it would have been for them. So that's where we're headed for much of the rest of the quarter. Today, we're going to take a look at a couple of shorter parables, and it will be those last 2. So still in Matthew 13, he spoke another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 pecks of flour until it was all leavened. And just for the record, you don't have to turn here, that was also told in Luke 13. And again he said, "To what shall I compare the kingdom of God? It is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 pecks of flour until it was all leavened." I'm emphasizing that one mainly because there's that kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God equality there, that if you happen to see one phrase versus another, you know that those are the same thing. Okay, so back to the leaven. How does leaven work? It permeates. Let's go down even to a more basic level. What do you do with leaven? What is leaven? Most of the time, yeast. And you mix it up and you put it into generally a bread. And what happens? It rises. The leaven, again, if it's something like yeast, there's actually a living organism and it produces gas bubbles. And those bubbles make the bread or the dough rise. At that time, leaven was typically some dough left over from like the previous day, the previous time that you were using it. And then it was mixed in with the new batch. So you have, I thought about doing a visual aid, but then decided it would be difficult for people to see. But imagine, if you go back to the kids' toy Play-Doh, comes in really bright colors. If I were to take one color of Play-Doh and just stick it in and wrap another color around it, I'm not sure that it would be hidden. What happens if you take a knife and cut through it? What do you see? you see two colors. You see the one that was at the core and the other one that was wrapped around it. So it's not exactly hidden. Now what if you take that same ball and you start squeezing it and mashing it and kneading it like you would knead dough? Eventually, do you see that small portion that's in the large portion? You don't. So it's hidden, and it's permeated, it's spread throughout the whole batch. Now, another interesting thing I learned, if we go back to that verse, a woman took leaven, and again, this was left over from her previous batch, so it probably wasn't much, hid in 3 pecks of flour until it was all leavened. So the hiding is that mixing it in until you can't see it anymore. And then the whole thing is leavened. Do you know how much 3 pecks is? This is the thing I learned. You might have a note in your Bible. It's like some notes will say a bushel. Or it might, something else I read said a couple of dry gallons. So she's got 3 of these. So imagine a 5-gallon bucket full of flour that she's making her dough from, or more. And then she's spreading a piece of the previous batch's dough. So that's what the type of situation that she would be in. She would be, making, I didn't realize it was such a large batch. You think, 5 gallons of dough would make a lot of bread. But that just gives an illustration of, okay, here we have the leaven, and we've mixed it in, and it's going to affect this large quantity of dough that she's now going to make bread from. Any other parallels you can think of about leaven? Qualities of it that may be pertinent. And we are getting to, the spiritual leaven of the kingdom. What does it do? How is there a parallel between leaven and the kingdom?
Like you said earlier, it's a living organism.
Oh, it's a living organism. Now, leaven isn't always, but at that time, it would have typically been, yes, a yeast or some sort of living organism. And that what do living organisms do? I heard something. They multiply. I was thinking grow, but yes. Once it's in there, you can't get it out. In what way are you thinking once it's in there? I guess just physically the leaven.
Something you cannot forget, right? So once it's told, once it's out there, it's in the system, or it's in the thing. So once the leaven's in, you can't separate that.
Okay.
Now, no, it's like the truth, right? Once you tell somebody the gospel.
There you go. There's the parallel. Once you tell somebody the gospel, they can't unhear it. Right, Hammond.
Make it work. Mm-hmm. So that's the same thing with the gospel.
That's right. There are certain conditions under which it will grow. If you put the leaven in your dough and then throw the dough in the freezer, is anything going to happen? It's not going to happen. So, yeah, there are certain conditions. But I think.
Along those same lines, but anytime I've worked with it, you have to feed it, so to speak, for it to be growing.
Good point. You have to feed especially like Tracy makes sourdough, you have to feed that sourdough starter, which is a leaven. So you do have to take care of it a little bit, don't you? You have to give it the right environment and food. Go ahead.
Can be killed.
It can be killed. Wow. I hadn't even thought of going there today. All right, so yeah, your leaven can be killed. If you put it into an environment that is hostile to it, then it can be deactivated. Those living organisms can be killed.
I like to look at it like a solid at one time.
So it's solid and it grows over time. Some things that were brought out by the guy who started this study is, and this follows on with, that leaven is mixed in until it has permeated the dough. So you can look at the kingdom as it works from within. One of the things Jesus said, we talked about, I think it was last week, where Jesus replied, the kingdom is in your midst. So the kingdom, as it grows, if you think of it, it's in the midst of the world, and it works from within the world to grow. Another thing is it has influence, and that influence spreads. So you have that leaven in the dough, and as it starts multiplying, as it starts producing those gas bubbles that cause the dough to rise, that influence spreads until the whole batch of dough has been affected. So in the same way, hopefully, the kingdom its influence is spreading throughout the world. And certainly, in first century, it was very fast. It has, in some ways, been exposed. The world has been exposed to it now, but there are always people that have not heard. Any last comments on leaven before we move to the next parable? Wow, go ahead, Tommy.
Well, it's analogous to the word. That's what we Christians are supposed to be doing, is spreading the gospel. And that's the word, which is Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And you get people into the word, and they start growing from within. That's what it's all about.
Right. Another parallel that fits right in. Starts. Okay, so moving on, we've got about 10 minutes to go. In verses 47 and 48, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet cast into the sea, and gathering fish of every kind. And when it was filled, they drew it up on the beach, and they sat down and gathered the good fish into containers, but the bad they threw away. So it will be at the end of the age. By the way, I'll pause right here before I read this sentence. The vast majority of parables that Jesus taught, he just gave the parable and let it go. There are a couple where he explained them to his disciples. This is an interesting one. This does not say, and he took his disciples aside and said to them the following. It just follows immediately in the text where he's giving a spiritual meaning to this parable that he just spoke. So, after talking about the fishermen with the fish, and then they separated, threw away the fish that were unacceptable. He says, so it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come forth and take out of the wicked from among the righteous, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. One of the few places where he gives some meaning, some spiritual meaning right away to a parable, and it appears to be to the public. So it is a little unique into that extent. So let's take the same approach. How does the net work? Any fishermen among us?
Boats on one side, it has weights on the other. So when they throw it out, the weights kind of sink down, and then they just...
Right. All right, so if you didn't hear, there are weights on it. So you throw it out, and one side of it sinks down. Some translations say dragnet, some will just say net. But this was not a net like you would have on a handle and just dip into the water and come up with one fish, hopefully a fish that you're looking for. This is a dragnet. So one side of it went down, and they pulled it across and caught basically everything that was in that area. So what did they have to do? It says, when it was filled, what did they do? They sat down, gathered the good fish into containers, and the bad fish they threw away. So that would have been, again, an everyday occurrence. I see a hand. Okay. So there's our picture of the net. Question, why separate the fish?
You want to call back all the bad ones along with the good ones.
That's right. You want to throw back the bad ones. Could just be because they're too small, I guess. But what was unique about the Jewish diet? There were things that were blank and blank. Clean and unclean. That's right. Some fish were not clean. They were not acceptable to eat. So they would have been very repulsive compared to the good fish.
The fishing environment where you're a fisherman, bad fish aren't going to bring you as much money as the good fish. So they're trying to up their income, so to speak. So they don't want the bad fish because they can't take that to the market to sell.
That's right. These people were not just fishing to eat. They were fishing to sell the fish. Again, it goes back to that economy. So there's a little bit of that mixed in here. But they were working on what has the most value, for our purpose. And it's this set of fish. So there's definitely, this is a good thing in our catch. And man, I wish we hadn't even caught this. This didn't even get caught. So there are reasons to separate the catch. So let's do a parallel back to the kingdom, just like we did. We've got this picture of a net that gets thrown out and catches every fish, and then you have to separate it. How is that like the kingdom? Tony mentioned in the illustration of the leaven, the word. The word gets thrown out there, and it was
Unforgiven sin is thrown out.
Yeah.
By the way, the predominant fish, we call them tilapia, but over in Israel they call them St. Peter's fish.
Really?
Yeah, you get that for free.
All right, bonus. So there's good fish and there's bad fish, and the parallel to the kingdom. This one is difficult. Nobody is jumping on this, and I'm not sure I blame you. The difficult part in this one, other than just saying, well, we're throwing out the net, we're going to try to bring in everybody we can, that whole section of you take what's in the net and they get sorted between the good and the bad. And it was even described, this, like I said, this is one of those things that Jesus said, at the end of the age, the angels will come forth and take out the wicked from among the righteous. So who is getting sorted is the big question. Somebody?
We are.
We are.
The sheep and the goats.
The sheep and the goats, okay. The people are getting sorted. I read about two different viewpoints on this parable. One is that this separation is, the angels are separating the people in the kingdom from the evil or the wicked in the world. And you see that same depiction in a parable we'll look at in a few weeks, the parable of the tares or the parable of the weeds, depending on what translation. And we're not going to turn there, but that gives a description of, a good versus evil, and they will be separated. It's definitely a judgment description. But the other interpretation, and honestly, I was a little surprised. Of the different readings that I did, I found this to be more prevalent in that this depiction of a judgment and a separation between the good and the wicked is within the kingdom. So I'm not necessarily going to come down on one side versus the other today, but the interpretation is that the kingdom is like this catch. You know, they throw out and they get all of these, and you end up with people in the kingdom, in the church, that may not quite have that heart for God. And if we had time to turn, Matthew 7 is the passage that, not everyone that says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter in. So interesting debate that some take one side, some take the other. Regardless of that, though, it definitely gives a depiction of a judgment between the faithful and the wicked. So however you want to look at, who is getting separated, the righteous are the ones that stay in the kingdom. What have we got? A couple of minutes. Okay. Again, going back to the author of this, I thought this was a good summary, parable, and he falls into that second camp. Many are brought in, and there are good and bad in the kingdom, but at the end, the kingdom will be purified. So if you're going to take that approach, I like that idea of purification. You say, Jamie?
We're not the ones that are purifying the kingdom. It's not up to us. It's not our decision. It's not our responsibility.
Absolutely. Jamie gets the prize for the day, I think. It's not up to us. We're not the ones doing that purification. We're not the ones doing the sorting and the deciding who is the good and who is the evil. All right, so last thing before we wind up. According to my clock, I've got 2 minutes. At the end, right after this parable, there's a question that Jesus says to his disciples, have you understood all these things? So it goes back to that idea of, why are you teaching in parables? So here, there's a bunch of parables related, and then he says, have you understood all these things? And they said to him, yes. And Jesus said to them, therefore every scribe who has become a disciple of the kingdom of heaven is like a head of a household who brings out of his treasure things new and old. So we don't have time to have a lot of discussion here, but I'll throw out a couple of thoughts for us to chew on as we leave. So a scribe would have been one knowledgeable in the text and the law. So every scribe, every teacher who has become a disciple of the kingdom of heaven, they will be bringing out treasure of things new and old. I look at this as, he's saying, are you understanding the parables? And he's saying, as a teacher, if you are a teacher, you're going to be responsible for understanding these things. There may be this simple story, but it is telling the properties and teaching you about the new kingdom that we have. So I thought that was interesting that they start off, why are you teaching in parables? And then Matthew has, I didn't count them, 4 or 5 parables in a row. And then he says, have you understood these things? So those may not have happened, even on the same day, who knows. But the sequence of the teaching is really good, where he's telling them, listen, said, the teachers, every scribe who has become a disciple will bring out treasure out of things new and old. All right, I am out of time. So we will close here, and we'll see you next week.